Hello? Jesus! Who are you? Who are you? And what are you doing in my grandfather's cottage?
The most important character in Sterling Point is someone we barely meet.
Connor, I'm freaking out. There's a girl here who looks just like Mom.
She is already gone before the story begins, and yet she seems to be everywhere. In an old photograph, in the corner of a lakeside cottage, in the face of a stranger, and in memories so faint that Annie is no longer sure whether they actually happened. Created by Megan Park, Sterling Point begins like a familiar summer drama. 17-year-old Annie Jacobson is rejected from the program she believed would secure her future. Soon afterward, she learns that she and her twin brother Connor have inherited a small Canadian island from the grandfather they were never permitted to know. Today, we are going to slow down with Sterling Point. We're going to talk about ambition as a response to loss, two sisters inheriting the same absent mother, the secrets parents call protection, and why an island can mean home to one person and freedom to another. Because Sterling Point isn't really asking where Annie belongs. It is asking what remains of us when the future we planned goes quiet and the past finally begins speaking. So Annie leaves New York and goes looking for answers, but the island does something strange to her. It takes away the schedules, the phone signal, the carefully planned future, and leaves her alone with the past. The lake is quiet. The cottage feels suspended in time. People sit together without constantly checking a screen. Conversations are allowed to wander. And gradually, beneath the romances, family revelations, and beautiful summer scenery, another story emerges. A story about a girl who became extremely good at living because she never learned how to grieve. Some children respond to loss by falling apart. Annie Jacobson responds by creating a 5-year plan. And that becomes our very first angle. Annie's ambition is not simply ambition. It is grief wearing very expensive, extremely well-organized clothes. When we first meet Annie, every part of her life appears controlled. She has a 10-step skincare routine. Her bedroom looks less like a teenager's room and more like the apartment of a 30-year-old woman who has already survived 2 divorces and discovered the importance of neutral-colored furniture. She knows where she wants to study, what she needs to accomplish, and presumably what time she plans to have her first nervous breakdown. Connor even tells her that she is 17, but behaves as though she is 30. It sounds like an ordinary joke between siblings. Psychologically, however, it tells us almost everything. Annie lost her mother when she was very young. When a child experiences a loss that cannot be understood or controlled, the mind sometimes creates control somewhere else. You cannot prevent death. You cannot demand that someone return. But you can make schedules. You can collect achievements. You can become so responsible, efficient, and prepared that life will never catch you helpless again. This is sometimes described as high-functioning grief. The person does not visibly collapse. In fact, they may become unusually productive. Everyone praises their maturity without realizing that the maturity was built as a shelter. Annie doesn't appear haunted because she has decorated the haunted house beautifully. That is why her rejection from the summer business program matters more than the program itself. She isn't merely losing an academic opportunity. She is losing evidence that her system works. Annie has followed every rule, anticipated every requirement, and behaved like the person she believes the future will reward. Then one email arrives, and the future says no. Ella Rubin plays this disturbance without turning Annie into a tragic figure. Her face remains composed, her voice stays quick, and her frustration often comes out as irritation rather than sadness. That distinction is important. Annie does not know how to say, "I feel unsafe." So she says, "This is ruining my plan." Then comes Sterling Point. The island cannot be organized in advance. The phone signal disappears. Strangers know things about Annie's mother that Annie herself does not. Her father's version of the family begins developing cracks. And the grandfather she was taught to avoid seems to have understood that she would eventually come looking. The island slowly removes the scaffolding holding Annie together. That is also why the show's unhurried pace works so well here. We watch Annie sit near the water, walk through an unfamiliar cottage, and absorb silences she would normally fill with activity. For perhaps the first time, there is nowhere productive for her to go. She can only remain still long enough for the feelings to reach her. What Annie discovers is painful. She did not outgrow her grief. She merely became very accomplished at running ahead of it. And Sterling Point is where it finally catches up. Imagine meeting a stranger who carries your mother's face, but none of your memories. Our second angle is the relationship between Annie and Ramona, two daughters who inherit the same mother, but not the same grief. Annie was adopted by Goldie. She remembers being held by her, even if those memories have become soft around the edges. Ramona is Goldie's biological daughter, but never knew her at all. One girl possesses memories without a biological connection. The other possesses the biological connection without memories. And somewhere inside that cruel imbalance, they're expected to become sisters. When Annie first sees Ramona inside the cottage, the resemblance is almost unsettling. For a moment, Ramona doesn't feel like a new person. She feels like the past becoming visible. Annie has traveled to Sterling Point hoping to learn something about her mother, and suddenly her mother's features are standing in front of her, guarded, angry, and completely uninterested in making this discovery comfortable. Ramona's hostility can initially make her difficult to like, but Amelie Hofrel plays that anger as something older than the conversation taking place. Ramona is not merely reacting to Annie. She is reacting to everything Annie represents. Annie grew up inside the family Ramona was excluded from. She had Goldie's affection, Stephen's protection, a beautiful home in New York, and the economic security to treat Sterling Point as an emotional adventure. Ramona inherited questions. So when Annie arrives expecting honesty, connection, and perhaps even gratitude, Ramona sees another privileged person asking her to perform emotional labor. She is being asked to welcome the girl who received the childhood she never had. But Annie's pain is equally real. Ramona may carry Goldie's face, yet Annie carries the terror of having once known her and still being unable to remember enough. She has spent years reducing her mother to a manageable sentence. She died when Annie was young. It was sad, and life continued. Ramona makes that sentence impossible to maintain. This is what psychologists sometimes call ambiguous loss, grief without complete closure, where the person is gone, but their presence remains psychologically active. Goldie exists between these girls as photographs, withheld letters, have memories and stories told by adults who cannot agree on what happened. There is no complete version of her available to either daughter. So Annie and Ramona begin assembling one together. Their most affecting moments are not the large revelations. They're the quieter exchanges, the conversations that soften halfway through, the shared spaces, the tentative physical closeness, and the simple act of braiding one another's hair. The show understands that intimacy rarely arrives through one dramatic apology. It is built through repetition, sitting beside someone again, asking one more question, choosing not to leave. Eventually, sisterhood becomes less about what Goldie gave them and more about what they can now give each other. Annie offers Ramona memories. Ramona offers Annie a part of Goldie that continued living after her death. Neither girl can return the mother the other lost, but together, they make that absence feel a little less solitary. And perhaps that is the most honest form of healing Sterling Point offers. Not recovering what disappeared, but finally finding someone who understands the exact shape of the empty space. Growing up does not begin when you stop needing your parents. It begins when you realize your parents needed help too, and never knew how to ask for it. Our third angle is about the adults of Sterling Point, and the uncomfortable discovery that parents are often just frightened people making permanent decisions with temporary emotional tools. For most of her life, Annie has accepted Stephen's version of the family. Her grandfather was someone she was not supposed to contact. Sterling Point belonged to a past better left untouched. Goldie died, Stephen raised the twins alone, and whatever happened before that was apparently too complicated or too painful to discuss. Then Annie finds the letters. That discovery changes more than the facts of her childhood. It changes the emotional meaning of her father. The man she understood as her protector suddenly becomes the person who controlled which parts of her own history she was allowed to know. Parents frequently call this protection. Children often experience it as theft. Stephen believes silence can contain the damage. If he hides the letters, avoids the island, and keeps Goldie's other life outside the family home, perhaps Annie and Connor can grow up without inheriting its confusion. But unspoken history does not disappear. It simply enters the family through other doors. Anxiety, resentment, overachievement, and the strange feeling that something important has always been missing. Stephen is easy to blame, and sometimes the show wants us to blame him. Yet Jay Duplass plays him with enough exhaustion that we can see the frightened person underneath the controlling father. He lost his wife. He was left with 2 children and a version of the marriage he could no longer question because the only person who could answer him was gone. His choices hurt Annie, but they were not made in an emotional vacuum. Goldie is similarly complicated. The more Annie learns, the less her mother resembles the peaceful, completed memory she has carried. Goldie had desires Stephen could not understand, attachments he could not accept, and an imagined life at Sterling Point that never became real. She loved her family, yet she also wanted to escape the shape that family had taken. The show refuses to make her either a saint or a villain. She was a woman who wanted incompatible things. Then there is Gordon, attempting to repair years of silence through an inheritance and a final instruction. Even in death, he cannot simply tell Annie everything. He creates a journey, perhaps because direct honesty was never this family's strongest language. Joe carries his own version of Goldie. Stephen carries another. Gordon carried another. Annie slowly understands that there is no single, clean explanation waiting to be discovered. Every adult remembers the past from the position where it hurt them. And this is one place where Sterling Point becomes more mature than its glossy teen drama packaging suggests. The mystery is not ultimately about identifying one guilty adult. It is about watching children inherit the consequences of choices made before they were old enough to speak. Annie, Connor, and Ramona believe that the truth will settle everything. Instead, every answer creates another emotional complication. Because facts can clarify what happened, but they cannot make the people involved less human. By the end, Annie is not simply learning who her parents were. She is learning the harder lesson. They were never the all-knowing adults she imagined. They were improvising. And the children are now living inside the story that improvisation created. Annie goes to Sterling Point looking for information. What she finds instead is time. And that becomes our fourth angle. Sterling Point is not merely a location. It is a different speed of living. New York has taught Annie to move toward the next thing, the next application, the next achievement, the next version of herself. Even rest has become another task inside her routine, something scheduled, optimized, and completed before tomorrow begins. The island offers her almost none of that. Phone reception disappears. Journeys happen by boat. People sit on docks without needing an occasion. The day is measured through sunlight on the water rather than appointments on a calendar. An old cottage remains imperfect because no one has replaced it with something more efficient. At first, Annie treats this stillness like an inconvenience. Slowly, it becomes medicine. The series was filmed around Ontario's Muskoka Lakes, and Megan Park allows the landscape to do more than make the show attractive. The water creates emotional distance from Annie's old life. Every boat ride feels like a small separation from the person she has been trained to become. By the time she reaches the cottage, the noise of New York has been replaced by birds, wooden floors, soft music, and the uncomfortable sound of her own thoughts. This is why the show's pacing may divide viewers. Some mysteries are prolonged by conversations that sensible people could have had much earlier. Certain plot lines appear, create a little movement, and then quietly disappear. The dialogue can occasionally sound too polished, as though these teenagers all share the same very expensive therapist. But the slowness is also the point. Sterling Point is less interested in rushing toward revelation than in observing what happens between revelations. It watches people prepare food, repair objects, sit together, and decide whether to say the thing they are thinking. Like a quiet daily vlog, the pleasure comes from accumulation rather than spectacle. One small gesture does not mean much. 10 small gestures become a relationship. Even Annie's love triangle works best when viewed through this idea of pace. Rory belongs to the life she already understands. He comes from New York, knows her social world, and fits neatly into the future she imagined. He is not written as a cruel rich boy, which makes the choice more interesting. Rory is kind, supportive, and familiar. But familiar is not always the same as necessary. Ellis moves differently. He pauses. He listens. He repairs the dog lamp that belonged to Annie's mother instead of attempting to impress her with something new. He does not ask Annie to become more exciting. He makes it possible for her to become less defended. So the real romantic question is not whether Annie should choose Rory or Ellis. It is which version of herself she wishes to continue feeding. Rory reflects the composed girl who arrived on the island. Ellis creates room for the girl beneath that composition, the one who does not have an answer ready, who can sit near the water without turning the moment into a plan. The island performs the same function. It does not fix Annie. It simply slows her down enough for the parts she has neglected to catch up. And perhaps that is why Sterling Point feels so comforting, in a culture obsessed with speed. It understands that some truths cannot be found by searching harder. Sometimes you have to stop moving long enough for them to find you. By the end of Sterling Point, Annie and Ramona have quietly exchanged lives. Ramona wakes up in Annie's New York bedroom, the controlled, comfortable world Annie once believed contained her entire future. Annie remains on the island, surrounded by water, old wood, and memories she can no longer dismiss as irrelevant. Neither girl has found a permanent home, but both have finally given themselves permission to leave the identity they inherited. That is what makes the ending more moving than the final romantic decision, or the last family revelation. The series begins with Annie believing that identity is something you construct through discipline. Choose the correct school, follow the correct routine, become the kind of person who never needs to look backward. Sterling Point teaches her that identity is also made from things we did not choose. The people who raised us, the people who left, the stories we were told, the stories someone decided we were too young to hear. Even the memories we can no longer clearly access continue shaping the way we love, plan, and protect ourselves. The show is not flawless. Some conflicts depend on characters delaying obvious conversations. Connor deserves more interiority than the season gives him. The teenagers can occasionally sound so emotionally literate that you wonder whether Muskoka has free therapy hidden beside the marina. And the final revelations arrive with enough soap opera energy to make the quiet cottage feel briefly like an episode of Gossip Girl, with better trees. But Megan Park's sincerity survives those weaknesses. She understands that grief rarely looks the way movies teach us to recognize it. Sometimes it is not crying beside a photograph. Sometimes it is a perfect academic record. Sometimes it is anger toward a sister who did nothing wrong. Sometimes it is preserving an old house, because selling it feels too much like agreeing that the person who lived there is truly gone. And sometimes grief becomes a question of privilege. To Annie, the island is sacred because it contains her only tangible connection to Goldie. To Ramona, selling it could provide financial freedom. One girl wants to preserve a memory. The other needs the value locked inside that memory. The series does not completely resolve this tension, and perhaps it should not. Love does not automatically erase class, resentment, or the practical cost of keeping the past alive. Ramona agrees to wait. Not forever, just long enough for Annie to understand what she is being asked to release. That temporary kindness may be the most believable expression of sisterhood in the entire season. And then Annie enters the water. The moment does not feel like a grand transformation. She has not solved her family. She has not completed grief. She has not become a carefree person simply because she spent one summer near a beautiful lake. She has only stopped running. For now, that is enough. Sterling Point may arrive dressed as a familiar YA drama: beautiful teenagers, first love, hidden parentage, and an island that looks designed for expensive vacation photography. But underneath that surface is a gentle story about the lives we build around absence. It asks whether home is the place where we were raised, the place where our history began, or simply the place where we finally feel safe enough to become unfinished. Perhaps there is no permanent answer. Perhaps home is sometimes just a pause between two versions of yourself. A quiet cottage, a sister in another city, a repaired lamp, the sound of water outside, and one memory returning when you are finally still enough to receive it.